Good morning. We continue the saga of the kings of Israel and Judah as we look today at 1 Kings 14 and 15. And sometimes as we're reading these books of the history, I'm going to talk a little bit more about it, but things kind of get a little bit ahead of themselves. We'll hear about this king, and yet, well, where does this guy come from? And you'll understand in just a moment, unless you already read through this. But at beginning of chapter 14, Jeroboam is king of most of Israel, and Rehoboam is king of Judah. And because of the separation there that has happened so far. And Jeroboam's son, young son Abijah becomes sick. And Jeroboam, knowing that he hasn't been faithful to God, and knowing he has probably no right to expect anything from the prophet of God, tells his wife to disguise herself and go to this prophet Ahijah, whatever his name is, and find out about their son. You know, what does the prophet say? Is our son going to live? Maybe hoping to have the prophet, say a good word of healing. So Jeroboam's wife disguises herself and goes. And it tells us that this prophet is old-aged and he is blind now because of his old age. But the Lord speaks to him before this woman gets there and says to him, tells the prophet, a woman's going to come. And it's the king Jeroboam's wife in disguise. And we have hard words for this king. And we don't hear those words until, the prophet speaks them to the woman, but she came, and it says she pretended to be another woman. But when the prophet heard the sound of her feet, he says, "Hail, how about you? How are you doing, wife of Jeroboam the king?" He knows who it is. And "Come in, wife of Jeroboam. Why do you pretend to be another? I am charged with heavy tidings for you." Heavy tidings doesn't sound like good news to me. And as we read through, it says, no, go tell Jeroboam, thus says the Lord, I exalted you from among the people. I raised you up to be a king. And yet, you're not like David. You didn't follow me. You have turned away. And you tore the kingdom away. He says, you tore the kingdom away from the house of David. I gave it to you, yet you have not been like my servant David, who kept my commandments and followed me with all of his heart. And we're going to get a little bit more about this King David in a minute, but David is the standard by whom the kings are rated, and we continue to hear about the house of David, and this is, even at the birth of Jesus, it's Bethlehem, the city of David, and of the lineage of David, but the prophet says, because you have done evil among all of those who were before you, and you have gone and made idols and cast images. You have provoked my anger. And therefore I will bring evil upon the house of Jeroboam. I will cut off from Jeroboam every male. And, it's horrible what's going to happen to Jeroboam's family. This son, the prophet says, but when you get home, when you step in the house, this son will die. And it happens. That's what it says down in verse 17. And Jeroboam's wife went up. When she came to Tisra, she came across the threshold of the house. The child died. But worse than that, the nation of Israel mourned the death of the son of the king. And I think about, national mourning. I remember being in grade school when President John Kennedy was assassinated, and the impact that had on us, grade school kids out in the middle of North Dakota, totally, so distant, but yet, it was a state of national emergency, national mourning, and this is what it was here, but worse was to happen to Jeroboam's family, because this would be the only child, the only male offspring that would end up being buried in a grave. The rest would be, die and would be eaten by dogs and carry on to birds, and it's just horrible even to think about. But this was, the anger of God was kindled against him, and You know, this God who is full of mercy, abounding in steadfast love and grace and forgiveness, also was an angry God at times. And, you know, God had helped the people, led the people in their conquest of Israel. He had driven out all of these other people and given them this highly productive land and showed his love and his grace, and yet, you know, they continue to turn away and to not follow and to worship idols. And I can point fingers like that, but, you know, when I point one that way, I got three pointing this way. And it's a reminder to me that, you know, we all can fall away from God so easily. There's so much to tempt us, and I commented on that yesterday, how, you know, the devil comes in so many different ways. But anyway, it says in verse 19, the rest of the acts of King Jeroboam and how he reigned are written in the book of the annals of the kings, or the chronicles of the kings, and we don't have that book. You know, we don't know what those stories are. And we'll read that also about King Rehoboam, who was the king of Judah. You know, it'll say that about him, you know, in a few more verses. You know, in verse 29, it says that the rest of the acts of Rehoboam and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the kings? You know, and as I said, we don't have those. But so while Jeroboam was reigning and Rehoboam was reigning, and it says he was 41 when he began to reign, and he reigned 17 years. And again, Judah did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They provoked the Lord to jealousy with their sins they committed. I mean, so they weren't any better than Jeroboam and his people. And then as we start chapter 15, it says in the 18th year of King Jeroboam, I mean, we heard about his, you know, he was buried in verse 19 or 20, you know, of the last chapter. But so now we're going to hear a little bit about Rehoboam's kingship while Jeroboam was there, and the person that takes over after Rehoboam as king, Abijam, I'll just refer to him as, so he reigned for some years after Rehoboam died, while Jeroboam was still in office as king. And so this is where, to me, it gets a little bit confusing sometimes. And this king, also, it says, committed all the sins that his father did before him, and his heart was not true like the heart of his father David. You know, here we're comparing him, being compared to David. And here's what it says, verse 5, because David did what was right in the sight of the Lord, and did not turn aside from anything that he commanded all the days of his life, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. So we again are reminded of David's sin, of David's, you know, I mean, David virtually could just as well have murdered Uriah himself, but it was a sin that was counted against David. But yet David was faithful. And again, David is the measuring stone for so much. And so then, you know, the verse 7, the rest of the acts of Abijam that he did are written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah. And there was a war between Abijam and Jeroboam. So, you know, these two guys that are kings of the Jewish people, of the Israelite people that God has chosen, I mean, they're still fighting between the groups. And then in the 20th year of King Jeroboam, then Asa began to reign in Judah. And Asa is faithful to God, and Asa does what is right in the sight of the Lord, and as his father David had done. It says in verse 11, Asa did what was right in the sight of the Lord, as his father David did. Well, David wasn't his father; he was grandfather or great grandfather, but David was, you know, Asa was one of David's heirs, descendants that way. And Asa cleaned the land up. He put away, it says he kicked the male prostitutes out. He did away with the idols. He did away with a lot of the images that they were worshiping. But in verse 14 says, the high places were not taken away. Nevertheless, the heart of Asa was true all of his days. And then now in verse 16, there was war between Asa and King Baasha, B-A-A-S-H-A, of Israel. And again, where does this king come from? I thought Jeroboam was king. Well, we're going to find out at the end of this chapter in verse 33 that in the 3rd year of King Asa of Judah, Baasha, son of Ahijah, began to reign over Israel. So again, you got to read ahead a little bit to catch up on what's going on right here as we're reading it. But Asa and Baasha fought, and all of the treasures were taken out of the temple. Even the shields of gold that they had been made were taken out of the temple, so they had to make shields out of bronze. I mean, what a letdown to have no longer this weighty gold shield, but just a plain old ugly old bronze shield. But this was the warring, the fighting that was going back and forth, and it just so much of the time it's because God is angered by the people of Israel, and we find out, that God says, I'm going to scatter my people. I mean, no longer are you going to be a united tribe of Israel. You're going to be scattered, and this is is known as the diaspora, the scattering of the people of Israel, and this is when many of the Jews then intermarry, and we get different nationalities, different peoples that way. But so often, as I said, we got to kind of read ahead a little bit to get where we are here, and we just continue to try to make a little bit of sense out of some of it. The one thing that I always take away from it is God's faithfulness to those who are faithful to Him. May your faith be strong this day.